Hello and welcome. I'm Shani Peer. I'm the director of the Maison Française of Columbia University, and we're very pleased to be hosting this conversation today along with our co-sponsors at Columbia, the Alliance Program, the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. We had, I think, 700 people signed up for this event, so it shows there's a lot of interest. And I'd particularly like to thank Fassin and Maboula Soumahoro for taking the time to join us. They've been doing a lot of these kinds of events, I think, recently. And they will be joining in conversation with Emmanuelle Saada, whom I'll introduce briefly in a moment. Eric and Maboula, because of their research and teaching interests, their engagement as public intellectuals, and also their deep familiarity with the US, are particularly well equipped to help us understand today what exactly Islamo-leftism is, or indeed whether it is, and why it's become such a hot button political issue, and also what it has to do or doesn't have to do with post-colonialism and intersectionality and race studies and all the other kinds of studies that have been supposedly inflicted by America on French universities. They will be introduced properly in a moment by Emmanuelle Saada, who is moderating today's discussion. Emmanuelle is my colleague at Columbia. She is professor of history and French at Columbia University. A main focus of her research and teaching is the history of the French colonial empire in the 19th and 20th centuries, with a particular interest in the law. She is the author of Empire's Children, Race, Filiation, and Citizenship in the French Colonies. And her current book is a historiographical examination of French and European colonization, written as a history of the present. We will be saving 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions from the audience. So if you'd like to submit a question at any point in French or English, you can do so using the Q&A button. And I also want to let you know that this discussion will be recorded and on our website within a couple of days. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us. And I now turn over to Emmanuelle Saada.
Thank you. Thank you, Shani. Thank you, Shani Peer, the director of the Maison Française, Fanny Gay, the assistant director. Thank you, Eric Fassin and Maboula Soumahoro for being with us today. And thank you, everyone. I see right now 195 participants to this discussion. Thank you very much for being here and for thinking with us about Islamo-gauchisme or Islamo-leftism in France today. And also beyond this, this phrase, the many different and connected controversies which have been shaking the French public sphere in the past months, maybe even the past years, but with maybe an intensification in the past months. So the expression Islamo-gauchisme, which brings together Islamism and the left, right, or even the far left, might sound oxymoric to an American ear. It was coined in the early 2000s by a French political scientist, André Taguieff, to describe what he saw at the time as a form of convergence between Islamism and the far left, a convergence that was built around a common enemy, right? Defined vaguely as capitalism or the West. This notion has circulated in the past 20 years in limited circles, and I would say almost exclusively in the circles on the far right, or on the right that is of the most conservative part of the right in France, before finding a much larger audience in the past month. Most of the time, the word is used to refer to the intellectual sphere, and more specifically to the academy, which is described or has been described in the past months in France as the epicenter of Islamo-gauchisme, but not the only place where Islamo-gauchisme would be deployed. After the beheading of history middle school teacher Samuel Paty in October, the French Ministry of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, gave an interview on one of France's most popular radio stations, Europe 1. And that day, he evoked Islamo-gauchisme as, I quote, an ideology that leads us to the worst possible situation. So making very clearly a connection between that terrible, terrible event and this ideology, this so-called ideology of Islamo-gauchisme. In February 2021, Frédérique Vidal, France's higher education minister, stoked the flames further. She announced a probe into Islamo-leftism in French universities, saying, I quote, "I think that Islamo-leftism is eating away at our society as a whole, and universities are not immune and are part of our society." So this really created an incredibly, started an incredibly sets of reactions in France and calls for a resignation. And a very trenchant response from an organization representing the presidents of French universities, which declared, I quote, "Islamo-leftism is not a proper concept, but a pseudo notion of which we would try in vain to provide even a hint of a scientific definition. It ought to be left, if not just to CNews presenters, then more broadly to the far right that popularized it." And here, I'm quoting from a very, respected organization of French presidents, of presidents of French universities. As you know, this polemic has been abundantly commented upon in the American media, from Donald Trump Jr.'s Twitter account to the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. It is often seen as yet another French idiosyncratic move, kind of French exception, but one that says something about larger cultural wars in the US and the world. So today, we decided to analyze this current polemic with two prominent French scholars. And as some of you have already gathered, if you know the participants, or as you will soon discover, we are not having a debate. We think a debate requires two or more participants who are willing to argue their positions, that is to say, to recognize the legitimacy of their opponent's positions. However, Islamo-gauchiste is a highly polemical term, and it's only a polemical term in the sense that no one says, I am a Islamo-gauchiste, or I defend a Islamo-gauchiste ideology. And as such, it's a part of an enterprise of delegitimation and a campaign of suppression, I would say, of emerging voices in France, and especially in the intellectual sphere. So today, with Eric Fassin and Maboula Soumahoro, we are trying to understand this campaign, its context and its consequences. We will also evoke, I'm sure, many other issues which are presented as connected to this polemic on Islamo-gauchisme, from the écriture inclusive, that is to say the reform of spelling and grammar in France to disrupt the privilege of the masculine gender in the French language, to the legitimacy of the category of race in the social sciences and in French society, to the question of the post-colonial or the decolonial, to the dangers of gender theory, to a perceived threat of an Americanization of French society. So you see there are lots of issues that are connected, right? Loosely often, but still connected to the question of Islamo-gauchisme. So to help us explore these issues today, I'm delighted to welcome two distinguished academics who also happen to be all friends. I must say that we had a third participant, Marwan Mohammed, who was scheduled to participate in the first in the debate when we first scheduled it in late March. Marwan Mohammed is a sociologist who has, among other things, worked on Islamophobia in France, and unfortunately could not join us today. And I would also say that both Maboula Soumahoro and Eric Fassin are experts of American culture, politics, and society. They have worked on the US. And they are often asked in France to explain both American debates and the process of the so-called Americanization of France. In a way, we are inviting them today to do the reverse and to explain to us French debates and the use of the American reference in the French debate. So like it's a kind of never-ending mirror effects. Maboula Soumahoro is an associate professor in the English department at the Université de Tours. She's a specialist of Africana studies and Atlantic studies. She has studied and worked and taught in the US in several universities and prisons, at Bennington College, at Columbia University, at Barnard College, and she also taught for the Bad Prison Initiative, and she has also worked in France in the Juvenile Detention Center at Villepinte and in Fresnes. She has served as a member of the National Committee for the Memory of and History of Slavery from 2013 to 2016 in France, and she is currently, and since 2013, she is the president of the Black History Month, an organization dedicated to the celebration of Black history and culture throughout the world. And she's obviously active on the French and European front of that organization. And she's the author of Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, Réflexion sur une identité noire, which was published last year at La Découverte, and is soon, I think, to be translated into English as Black is a Journey, Africa Now, the name. And that book received the prize from the committee of the FEDCAN Maryse Condé Prize in 2020. Éric Fassin is a professor of sociology at Paris 8 University in Paris with a joint appointment in the departments of political science and the Department of Gender Studies. And I would say that the Department of Gender Studies at Paris 8 is the only one of its kind in France. He's worked extensively on the question of the politics of gender, sexuality, race, and intersectionality, both in the US and in France. And he defines himself as a sociologue engagé, a committed sociologist who has, tried to bring together academic work and public interventions. Among other things, he is a co-founder of an academic network in defense of gender studies called l'International du Genre, the Gender International, and he's been very active with colleagues from other countries facing enormous difficulties and obstacles in their work, in Turkey and Brazil notably. He has published many books, and one recent one is 2017 book Populisme, le grand ressentiment, which was translated in 5 languages and is currently at work on several projects, including a book entitled Représentation minoritaire, minority representations, and another one called The Paradoxe majoritaire. And I suppose this is books that are being published together, or at least should be read together. So thank you very much, both Maboula and Eric, for being with us today and for trying to explain to us this moment in France and maybe beyond France, right? This moment is controversy and all the elements that are political and intellectual elements that are attached to it. So maybe to start with, could you tell us a little more about Islamo-gauchisme, about the recent history of the uses of this phrase in France and maybe even beyond France? And could you tell us exactly, if this is a controversy, if this is a polemic, what is being targeted in this polemic? I don't know who wants to start.
We should start. Do you want to start, Maboula, or should I?
You should start.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Maboula, but also thank you, Emmanuelle, thank you, Shani, thank you, La Maison Française, and everyone attending this conversation. Well, as you pointed out, this has not been a debate. However, many of us, including Maboula and myself, have been invited to participate in debates. That is, on the one hand, there's a campaign against us, and we're asked to respond, which means that, in fact, we're in the position of the accused. That is, we're the targets of this campaign. And so I congratulate La Maison Française for deciding not to have a debate, that is not to pretend that this is a debate. As you pointed out, what's going on today is that no one is claiming to be Islamo-gauchiste or any other term. And the same applies to many terms. We've been asked recently to talk about cancel culture as if there were many people in France who defended cancel culture. But this is a history that actually takes place between France and the US, because we've had the same conversation 30 years ago with political correctness, where an American concept was imported into France immediately and presented as a debate between two positions, whereas it, in fact, was a campaign against some positions. So we have a repetition of attacks, of campaigns that are targeted not just at the left, but in fact, at the academic left. That, I think, is the most striking element. We've seen that in particular in the early 2010s with the attacks on the so-called theory of gender. In other countries, people have talked about ideology of gender, but the French emphasis on theory is a way of saying this is just these weird academics who are talking about strange things. And this is repeated over and over again. We are asked, how can you talk about race? How can you talk about intersectionality, etc.? So what is at stake, I believe, is critical thought. On the one hand, of course, there's a right-wing drift of politics, not just in France, but in many countries. The result has been attacks on minorities. But it's not just minorities, whether sexual or racial, it's also gender studies, it's also critical race studies. And this, I think, is a very central element, the anti-intellectualism that has developed, which is also anti-academic, supposedly elites.
Thank you. Maboula, do you have
I think I agree with everything Eric just said. I don't know, for my part, I would perhaps bring a focus on the racial dynamics of the questions. I think that this controversy of around Islamo-leftism is nothing new. So Eric is right to go back to the 1990s and political correctness, or even gender studies in the early 2000s. But I'm really interested, based on my own experience of French academia, I'm interested in all the the individual trajectories of students, graduate students of color, who were accused in a bit differently because the terminology was not the same, but who were accused of not being scientific enough, not being I don't know, scholarly enough, and who were denied fellowships, who were denied opportunities to complete their doctoral work, who were denied positions within academia once they had defended their dissertation. And at the time, those accusations, this lack of objectivity, the nonsense of certain themes, was coming directly from people in power within academia. So I'm thinking of this, those generations and this genealogy of students who were expelled from academia on the very same reasons that are being used now by like the secretaries of higher education and education, the president of the Republic, on the same grounds. So at least today, there is a controversy. There are public debates. There are open discussions, which even though they are violent, may also mean that there is more inclusion at the teaching level, but also at the student level within academia. So there is a change in demography. There is a change in the like topics of interest that now forces higher institutions to say things on those particular topics. But before that period, the academia itself was saying the same thing to particular students and to particular faculty. So that's all I could add to what Eric just said.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
If I may, Emmanuelle, just to concur, of course, with Maboula said, I would just add, as she mentioned, the President of the Republic has spoken on these issues. And at the moment, we are targeted not just by some political parties, but by the President and by the Minister of Education and by the Minister of Higher Education, etc. So I think that's an element that is a change compared to before, which may very well be a reaction against the changes that have just been described by Maboula. And the virulence of this debate is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that the Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, has talked of an intellectual complicity with terrorism. So it's not just disagreement, because basically terrorism is something that you can be sued for. And indeed, the Minister of Education wanted to sue a union that talked about state racism. So I think there's a different level of intensity that has been developing in the last year or so.
But is this only intensity? I mean, obviously, I mean, there is intensity. It's obvious in the, you know, in the newspaper, in the media, in the social media, and in the way that, you know, it is being reflected in the US. I mean, like the number of articles that have been published in the, you know, the thing that a lot of people on this call, I'm sure, must read, like, you know, New York Times, the Washington Post. So there is a sense of intensification, but so you're saying something that I think would require some disentangling for the audience, for the American audience here. So we hear race, we hear gender, we hear, you know, those issues that obviously have a very long history and maybe a shorter history in the French academia, right? But I've been there for a long time. And then you have this word like Islamism, right? So there is a very, I mean, I think for an American public, a slightly a dissonance here, a cognitive dissonance in like thinking about race and gender, and how is that being actually bundled with the question of Islamism? How do people do that? How does that work from your perspective?
The magic trick, Emmanuelle. That's the magic trick. But more seriously, I think that whenever Islam is mentioned within the French context, I think that this is something that the audience might need to pay attention to. It's actually a debate, a conversation, a discussion around race. Islam is for race. There is race when it's not. You cannot think only of Islam as a religion, as a religious issue. To me, to use the term Islam within the French context is a veiled manner to talk about racial issues by way of, by way of religion. And talking about Islamism, for instance, is also talking about politics and, you know, national security and you know, terrorism. But Islam is the entry point to racial matters, because we don't discuss race that openly in France. So whenever you use Islam, whenever you talk about, you know, places of origins, whenever you talk about, you know, immigrants, people born elsewhere, these are the moments when you are talking about race within the French context. That's my take on it.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to in a minute about on the issue of the let's say the larger political context that have fed this you know, this point of intensity, hotness in French debates today. But one of the things that I think is super interesting from that is interesting in general, and that I think we need a specific answer from you guys, especially as a specialist of American studies working in France, is the American referent, right? Why, I mean, like in all these debates, bizarrely, Islamo-gauchisme is connected also to the Americanization, right? So the woke ideology is also invading France, right? racialization of personal and social interactions are being supposed to be imported to France, right? A form of intense identity politics is also important. So, and so you see interesting examples, including actually the example of Columbia University, of the idea that there were like separate celebrations for the for class day, for the college graduation, according, that groups had decided to have their own, in addition to obviously to the common yet online, that is to say not very common, graduation ceremony. There were several celebrations of several groups, communities at Columbia. And this example, I saw it in Le Monde, I saw it on French TV. So Columbia, the example of Columbia is very much talked about with really a sentiment of a feeling of disgust, it seems to me, right? Or at least scandal. So could you explain to us a little more the use of the American referent? I know, Eric, you've written a lot about this starting in the 90s in France. What's going on with this? Is this the same old song, or are there new lyrics on that song?
Well, if I can give it a shot, I think what happened in 1989, instead of using the US as a good model, it became a bad counter model. And in particular, this coincided with a redefinition of the Republic. The Republic was supposed to be France and was based on the idea that you just have individual citizens. The counter model was America, and America was about communautarisme. Of course, the word does not translate too well into English, paradoxically, but let's say identity politics. And this idea of communautarisme has played a major role as a way of discrediting minority politics, whether they be sexual politics or racial politics. So there's a recycling of this rhetoric today. For example, the president tried to update it by talking about séparatisme. Séparatisme, communautarisme, it's rather similar. But I think this recycling of the rhetoric is always very important because basically it feels familiar. We've heard for decades about the Republic as a French thing, and minorities that are never called minorities, that are called communauté, that are just dismissed as the counter Republic. So in the name of universalism, you can discredit people asking for more equality. Because they endanger the Republic. And the rhetoric focuses at the moment on the idea of identity. The idea that people who say we're not treated equally, in fact, they're really Americanized, they're really into multiculturalism. What they want is a specific identity. So the rhetoric can be recycled very efficiently because everyone can feel like a universalist while denying equal rights.
Thank you. Maboula, do you want to intervene?
I think Eric has explained everything, but I would also like to add the fact that there's just mere ignorance of US academia, and there's also this this manner in which US academia is rendered very simple, as if, we are talking about the Americanization when we're talking about the US-ization of those things. We're not talking about the rest of the continent. We're talking about the United States of America, really. And for whoever is, has been on US campuses or is familiar with US academia, it only reflects in these public discourses taking place in France is that people don't know what they're talking about. I mean, like one of the blatant example that we could use today is that what would people make of you, Emmanuelle Saada? You're a French person, teaching on a US campus. So does it make you American? When did you become American? When did your, scholarly productions began reflecting the state of mind of the United States of America. You know, we have the whole world on US campuses. Your colleague, Suleiman Bachir Diane, is from Senegal and also studied in Paris, France. So is it less Senegalese? Is he less French? Is he American now? What does that mean? Mamadou Diouf. I'm thinking about Spivak. I'm thinking about Spivak, who comes from India, and all the people who have been, I'm going to say, lured into US academia that provides sometimes better work conditions, or, you know, all the means that are necessary to carry out your scholarly work. So even if I was myself to, you know, forsake France and come to Colombia and live in the US for the rest of my life, would I suddenly become, you know, a representative of the US just because at age 45 I decide to leave France and establish myself in New York? So, you know, a lot of those things about the Americanization is really, you know, groundless, and it's really about a political battle rather than an intellectual battle. It has no intellectual foundation. That's no, the battle is about, you know, the stakes is around, you know, political representation, you know, access to resources, teaching positions, but it has no real intellectual foundation. Just like the example you said, you just gave about, you know, the denouncing of the I don't know, ethnic or racial commencement parties on Columbia campuses. Anybody who's been on Columbia campus knows that there's the general commencement ceremony, and then each department or program is free to do whatever they want to do. So this is just I don't want to use this term, but this is fake news. This is fake news. This is ridiculous. This is not true. And this is what makes it so serious. And this is what makes it so dangerous, because truth and reality do not matter. So what are we talking about really? What are we defending? What are we explaining when the people talking to you are not based in reality? We're just fighting. So there are high political stakes. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it means.
Yeah, actually,
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry, just one quick thing. The paradox is that all the vocabulary that is used in public polemics is very difficult to take seriously. When you hear about laïcité, most of the time, you know, it does not refer to a secular conception of the state, because it does not apply to the Catholic religion, but only to Islam, for example. But this goes for most of our vocabulary at the moment. Universalism tends to be called French universalism, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms. In fact, what it means is that there's something very provincial about this. And in particular, as has been pointed out by Maboula just now, the sort of internationalization of academic life is denied in the name of universalism. Mm-hmm. That, I fear, has damning consequences for French intellectual life. If we start considering that French intellectual life should be about Frenchness, that means it's becoming very provincial. So many of us are trying to resist this provincialization of France.
Thank you. So, Eric, you're taking the debate in a slightly different direction than where Maboula left it. So I had a question coming from Maboula's precision about the political stakes. If the American referent is used as in the form of a proxy, right, to fight French battles in France, I mean, French battles, which battles are we speaking about? So there is this whole context of separatism, right, that you've already evoked, the law on separatism, which, as far as I know, is still being worked on by the parliament, right? They're still working back and forth between the Assembly and the Senate, if I'm not wrong. It's not set yet. But what is the context in which, you know, the immediate political context? Obviously, there is this law, and the enormous debate is generating in France, because it actually has very concrete consequences for individuals, but also maybe the upcoming elections of the presidential elections in May. 2022. A year from now, and you already see a lot of movement in France around the elections. Could you explain a little more what you think, if any, actually, what might be the underlying kind of stakes that explain where the intensification in the past year over the controversy of the polemic?
If I may begin, I think that I want to clarify the fact that when I was talking about the political stakes, I was thinking, beyond institutional politics. So of course, the obvious, upcoming deadline is the presidential election, even though there are going to be local elections just next month. I was talking about, in political, in a more general manner, the access to power, access to representation, access to resources, access to, rare resources. And I think that the general context that we need to keep in mind is that of this post-colonial moment that is reshaping the vision that the Republic has of itself. I think this is what it is. This, the theory of a universalism that is being, challenged, that is being interrogated by the mere presence of populations of color within hexagonal France, and not only in the overseas departments and regions. So it is, I think it has become more and more, it has become increasingly difficult for France to uphold this, ideal, this utopia in the very presence of those bodies of color. I think that is the novelty. And that is what I'm talking about here is the demographic evolution, the demographic transformation of, again, hexagonal France, not the overseas departments. So what is France going to do with that? And I think it creates a lot of anxiety, national anxiety, but it also creates very concrete tests of this universalist ideology. Very concrete. It's not only a discourse now, it has to become a practice, and this practice seems to be difficult to maintain. So this is the political aspect that I had in mind. And then the elections, of course, and the institutional politics that are unfolding right now is to be taken into account. But the transformation of the demographics and the the no longer avoidable, no longer I don't know, deteriorizable racial question. It's not only about the colonies, it's not only about the overseas departments, now it's within France. So what is France going to do about that?
If I can pursue this, I fully agree that it's not just about elections, but I think Maboula agrees it's also about elections. And there's the chronology of the evolution of society, but there's the chronology of elections, and the two are mixed. I think what's been happening could be called a sort of Welbeck syndrome. You may recall the novel Submission by Welbeck, which created such an uproar, all the more so because it coincided with the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. What was striking is the story it told. It was a story about Islam taking over. And it pretended to be half serious, explaining how it could work out in the elections. Now, what is interesting is that, of course, what is happening in France today is that everyone is thinking that it's very well possible that the extreme right could take over the presidency next year. So it's a way, I mean, concentrating on Islamo-gauchisme is a way of using the language of the National Front or the National Rally today. So I think there's a way of turning tables around, as if the main threat in France were Islam and not the extreme right, that is Islam and not fascism, but also as if the main threat in France were people like Maboula and me, which of course is kind of flattering, but seems to me a bit misguided despite the considerable importance that both of us and a few others have in our minds at least. So I think there's something going on, which is a way of not looking at reality, but turning things around, upside down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is really worrisome because it means that reality does not exist. If you look at the debate as it is going on now, we keep having people telling stories about things that didn't happen or just making them up, et cetera, and this replaces reality. So for me, there's something like the Gresham law that with bad currency ousting good currency. And I think the same is going on today in the reality of debates going on in public discourse.
And actually, in France, there is this long tradition of, science and like knowledge and the intellectual, right, a figure invented at the end of the 19th century to tell truth and to speak truth to power. What is the role? I mean, so this controversy attacks, right? It's an attack against the emergence, as far as I can understand what you're saying, against different voices in France, a lot of differences, right? And threats, things that are being seen as threats. And it seems to be fed on fake news, on a distortion of reality. And yet we have an instance normally, and that is academia, right? That is there to remind us of reality, of, especially the social sciences, right? To establish facts. And yet this is in the social sciences, again, if I understand well the French debate, that it is the French social sciences that have been targeted, right, most intensely by this polemic. So can you say a little more about maybe what is going on right now in terms of maybe the dilution of epistemic power of an older generation, or a change of regime, maybe in the way that society is being described scientifically, and with the whole status in a way of of academia. That is actually very interesting. It seems to me that Islamo-gauchisme has been identified as being produced, right, by academics, especially by social scientists. And again, maybe there is fake news there, right? Because we have to assess the reality of this analysis, or its accuracy. But could you tell us a little more, maybe, about the perceived threats, in a way, of the transformation of French universities, since you're both working in French universities, right?
Do you want to start, Maboula, or should I? I imagine, since I don't hear you, that you're suggesting that I might.
Sorry, yes, I was saying go, please go.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I would say is that attacks against the social sciences are not entirely new in France. We've had President Sarkozy and then Prime Minister Emmanuelle Saada attacking the social sciences because they were supposed to justify by explaining. So explaining is justifying has been a rhetoric used against the social sciences. So it's not entirely new. What may be new is that, of course, today, some of these battles are not just against the social sciences, but also within the social sciences. And some of our colleagues are uncomfortable with the fact that the world, it is changing, if I can put it this way. And I believe that, in fact, what has come to the surface, and this I think was made clear in Maboula's presentation before, is the fact that the university used to be not only colorblind, but white. And now that it's a little bit less white, still massively white, but a little bit less white, the question of colorblindness becomes an issue. Can we be colorblind if being colorblind means that we're all white? or do we have to rethink all this? This, I think, is going on. And so, in fact, it raises questions about us. When I say us, I mean the older generation of people who've been around for a while. How come we accepted so well to be in this sort of lily white academic world in the name of universalism, including in the name of scientific universalism?
Maboula, do you want
I don't have the answer.
to add to this? There's a question that leaves us speechless.
I don't think if I have anything to add to what Eric just said. No. I think, but your last question, Eric, about how did we accept, but you were talking about older generations, saying how did we accept this, or how did we believe in or buy into this myth of colorblindness within academia? Is it what you said?
What I say is that the people who are unhappy about the changes within academia are the people who felt quite comfortable within a strictly white colorblindness.
Exactly.
I'm not saying that we all did. I hope not.
Yeah, I was hoping, but yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We had, maybe it doesn't look like it, but we did prepare and had a series of questions for the panelists, but time is flying. So I suggest that we move to the Q&A. We have tons of questions. I don't think, unfortunately, I will be able to bring all the questions to the fore. I will do my best. And actually, I will start with the question that were some of the questions that I had in mind for our panelists, but are phrased in a very interesting way by members of the audience. So thank you for that. One of the questions is actually about the specificity, the French specificity of this movement. There is one question, and sorry if I do not mention everyone by name, but here I see a question by Frédérique about the distinctively French character of this controversy. It seems that there are similar attacks against the social sciences and against, in general, anti-racism in the UK and the US. And so could you speak about maybe the global dimension of this?
Should I start? Well, indeed, it's not just about France. As Emmanuelle mentioned in her presentation, I've been working with colleagues from other countries, including Brazil, Turkey, but also others in Hungary, etc. And in all these countries, we have attacks against critical thought, against the social sciences, etc. And it's not just those countries, it's going on in many places. So this, I think, has to do with the authoritarian turn of neoliberalism. That is the idea that neoliberalism after 1989 claimed to be not just about the freedom of markets, but also the freedom of individuals. I think the emphasis today is more on markets than individuals, and more on money than on rights. So I think that goes with an authoritarian turn, which means that the difference between a country that is supposed to be liberal like France and a country that's supposed to be illiberal like Hungary is not so clearly visible at times. I think at the same time that if we compare situations in different countries, one relative specificity that I can see in France compared to Britain, compared to many other places, is that this anti-intellectualism that we've been talking about, this opposition to critical thought, is not just on the right. It's not just on the far right. It's very widespread. And we have many people, for example, in the Socialist Party, but also in other parties on the left, who are very much tempted to borrow the rhetoric of Islamo-gauchisme or borrow the rhetoric of communautarism or separatism or etc., etc. So I think that may be a relative specificity of the French case. That is the fact that the left is at a loss in how to respond to these attacks that come from the far right. One illustration of this was the fact that we had a prime minister, Manuel Valls, who was supposed to be a socialist and then became a right-wing candidate just after that in Barcelona. That means that the left, as he famously said, could very well die in France.
Thank you. Do you want to add to this, Maboula, or? Oh, no. So actually, interestingly, one of the questions I think could be connected to this, and that's a question that was raised by, I think, Megan Emery about a previous conference with Christiane Taubira. I think Christiane Taubira was speaking at Harvard at 12. This is constant Zoom, the constant Zoom meetings we are under now. So we were able to listen to Christiane Taubira with Marie Lewis earlier today. I was not able to, but Megan Emery is reporting that she said she would not run for the French presidency at that talk, at that meeting, and so do you see any possibility, right? She could have been a good candidate for pushing for those issues, right? Given her not really, you don't think so? That's interesting. Given her record, right? I mean, the 2001 Taubira law was an important step, I think, in recognizing the law that declared the
slave trade and slavery as crimes against humanity.
The crime against humanity was an important step, I think, towards opening a space for thinking about those issues, both in academia and in the public sphere. But if Eric, your expression of disagreement piques my interest, so I'd like to know more. But what else? What are the political perspectives, right? If the left is actually extremely divided around those issues? It's a hard question, I know.
The left, I don't know, but the left has been disappearing. The left that seems to be, at least inclined to understand or to some of the issues that we've been talking about is not so well positioned. And I think that we are witnessing an ongoing, I mean, that started long ago, but an ongoing, rightization of the political debate. I mean, some issues that were clearly associated with the National Front in the 1980s have become the rhetoric that is used in other, parties that were supposed to be so different from the National Front. There's been how can I say, an institutionalization of the National Front that has changed its name and that has become a regular party. But I think in the rhetoric itself, in the platforms themselves, there is simply a stark right-wing turn adopted by mainstream politicians. And then there are other non-mainstream forces, but that do not have the leverage to be, represented at the institutional level, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, one of the attendee here was offering and that's his name is Benjamin Broad, was suggesting was giving a historical hypothesis, saying maybe France has not been able to come to terms with Pétainism. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's a French trajectory here, right? So it's kind of said Pétain redux. Or is this, or is there, in those kind of global movement, right? We spoke about Hungary, about the UK, Brazil, obviously, right? Is there something else going on? I mean, or is this a combination of, let's say, as Eric was saying, kind of a neoliberal turn toward conservatism, and a specific French history that is, kind of a clash of those two dynamics is creating this.
I wouldn't be too sure about Pitonism because I'm not that familiar with that episode of French history, but I feel like France is simply facing long I don't know, hidden issues that are just resurfacing, and it's no longer possible to ignore. So maybe Pitonism and World War II issues and anti-Semitism and genocide and in Europe and outside of Europe, and maybe it's time to face history, to face the present.
Yeah, so thank you to Annika Barra. I'm sorry, it's my French accent, a terrible French accent. It's Pétainism, right? The movement associated with Marshal Pétain, the head of the French state, l'État français, between 1940 and 1944. And my apologies for my sometimes cute, but most often extremely bothering French accent.
But I would say two things. One is that maybe the better reference would be decolonization or the Algerian War or whatever, because in fact, the issue of anti-Semitism was very much central for Pétain and the Vichy regime. I don't think that today it is central, despite the fact that we've had Darmanin making strange anti-Semitic pronouncements. But that tends to be more an exception than the rule. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, I would be reluctant to say that the French or that France has been unable to do this or that, because that raises for me a political question. Does that mean that Maboula and I are not French? That is, if we start saying that France is caught up in this cultural history and cannot escape it, that in a way reinforces the argument of those who are saying that in the name of national identity, we should not speak about this or that. That's only the negative version of another positive version. But both tend to depoliticize because they culturalize the debate. I prefer to think that there's a battle going on. Of course, we're not on the winning side. But I
members of the audience, John Torpy is suggesting to think about this, to add a, let's say, a class dimension to this. He's asking about the argument that has been articulated here in the US that populism and the dislike for the Democratic Party among the working classes or the popular classes in the US was a reaction to liberal anti-racism, right? So, and that was an important element in Trump's victory in 2016, right? And it is near victory in 2020. So is there any sense that there is, kind of a similar backlash, right? So it's a battle, but it's a battle that would be played along class lines in France too.
Okay. So I'll begin. I think that one thing that needs to be clarified, perhaps once and for all, is that race doesn't trump class, and class doesn't trump race. It's not one or the other. It can be like the vision, the perception of racial issues as completely pure and having to do only with race is precisely the problem we have in our understanding, global understanding of how race works, actually. Race doesn't erase class. And if we're talking about the electorate of Donald Trump back in 2016, and the myth, because it has also been a myth of poor white America widely supporting Donald Trump. Poor white America was not the only segment of of the United States that supported Trump. There was also the invisible or less covered by the media, wealthy, affluent, white Americans, or white women, for instance. That this has been an argument used by the the Black feminists who exposed the data in the statistics of the voting, saying I don't know, 92% of African American women had voted for Hillary Clinton, when over 52% of white women had supported Donald Trump, right? And Black feminists in the US had said, we have done our share beyond class issues, beyond racial issues. So I think that there's really a myth to be debunked around race or class. It's not true. And this vision is really a limited vision of both race and class, and how whiteness operates. Like a social class is not only about white people. There are poor populations of color too. And what do we make of them? And what do we make of more affluent segments of society of color? So it's all woven together, and this threat of the focus on race that will erase the significance of class is a long overdue argument. I mean, since 1941, historian Eric Williams published a classical work of history entitled Capitalism and Slavery. Right? There have been traditions of scholars and activists who have been Black Marxists, for instance, so these questions have been worked. They have been dug into for a long time. So we need to get rid of this myth that race trumps class. It's not true. It's simply not true. Race doesn't trump gender. It doesn't trump ableism. It doesn't trump anything. It doesn't. It simply does not.
I agree fully. What I would add is that, in fact, the poor didn't vote for Trump in 2016. They voted 12 points more for Hillary Clinton. So it's a myth, an empirical myth, according to all the available data. What happened, though, and what happens even more in France, is that because in France it is true that for a while the working class has been voting more for the National Rally than for other parties. So that's more the case in France than it is in the US. However, there's a very simple explanation, is that basically, first, right-wing working class voters have stopped voting for right-wing parties. They vote for far-right parties. But left-wing voters of the working class have stopped voting at all. So on the one hand, the left-wing people are not voting, they're just staying home. And the right-wing people, they're voting for the far right. That's what explains the change. It doesn't mean that all workers have moved to the right. It means that those that are on the right have moved towards the far right, and those who were on the left have stopped voting because left-wing parties were not on the left. So this, of course, needs to, we should start with what Maboula said, but I just wanted to add that empirical stuff.
Okay, thank you. So we have only a very few minutes left. And I'm tempted to do something that maybe I should not do, which is to leave the more kind of very local political debates about France and elections and what might happen in 2002 and the National Rally and so on and so forth, and go back to larger issues by looking at those questions and trying to to justice to the enthusiasm of our audience for the many questions. Maybe one of them is one series of questions is about the kind of educational policies. Michael Harris was asking about the consequences in terms of education of this controversy. I mean, like, since you said the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Higher Education were involved, would that translate into the curriculum on one hand? And then we had Theo Mention let's call it, I'm sorry, I'm franchising your name, asking about the attempt by some social scientists. It's a slightly different question. I'm trying to bring them together, of remaining apolitical in this, and so advocating for apolitical objectivity as a way to respond to this kind of attacks, right? So the academics in their teaching and their research not taking a political stance and saying, you know, we're going to be as scientific as possible, as neutral as possible, and Theo Montion mentioning this as itself a political stance, right? So, and he's asking how to convince the general public of the importance of situated knowledges. So, could you answer to the two questions? Answer the two questions, both the possible consequences, immediate consequences on curricula, and then the more specific issue of, you know, what to do with situated knowledges. What can academics do with that notion?
If I may begin, I don't know what the educational impact is going to be. I don't know if we're going to witness what could be considered as a backlash, given some of the progress that had been made in, I'm talking about primary and secondary school curricula, in the, you know, subjects of history, the subject of history and you know, colonial history, slavery history has been more included, not totally included, but more included. So if those gains are going to be taken away, that could be, you know, that would be the backlash. And I'm reluctant in my use of this word because, you know, backlash comes after some you know, progress, real progress. So if all these, you know, crumbles, we get a backlash, then, you know, I don't know what to say. What can also be interesting is to witness the fact that, you know, the Secretary for Education was so vocal on those issues when he's not the one in charge of higher education. These are two different secretaries. Those are two different departments, you know, like secondary and primary and secondary school, you know, education, and higher education. So it's interesting to see that, yes, this, you know, Blanquer, the secretary for education, was so vocal on those issues and was so listened to. It again, it didn't make any sense. It did not make any sense. It made political sense, of course, but not, you know, logical rationality. Perhaps a few things about the person who spoke about objectivity, apolitical objectivity. I think it's a privilege. I think that, you know, politics, again, needs to be understood as not only institutional politics. Sometimes your mere presence is political. Sometimes you're not even trying to engage. It's just your body is a political disruption. So I think we need to enlarge our understanding of politics. So remaining apolitical is a privilege, in my view, that some people simply do not have once they are part of particular spaces and spheres.
I think that some of our colleagues who were not happy with what we and others were doing have been, in some ways, happy about the current attacks, and so have joined forces objectively with the attacks against academia as a way of saying, let's depoliticize academia. That's one thing. Second, about the Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, you're right, it's paradoxical that he spoke about higher education, but I would not underestimate the fact that, for example, what has been happening in secondary education is that the social sciences have lost ground considerably in the last few years. And so, in fact, critical thought is not just for higher education. Critical thought is also taking place in the secondary schools. For example, sciences sociales in the secondary schools is sciences économiques et sociales. More and more, it's sciences économiques, less and less sciences sociales. So I think this is happening at every level. In a higher education, we don't quite know yet because it's recent. After all, the minister spoke in February, and we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but we already know that, for example, it made it possible in one university to change the profile of a job position that was being offered to get rid of intersectionality. And so we can anticipate that intimidation will have real consequences. It has consequences already on our students. How are you going to decide you might apply for a fellowship if you include some of the key terms that might be poorly received with race or with intersectionality or with whatever? And so I think it has consequences already, even though we're not fully able to measure it. But finally, the climate has also meant that quite a few academics have felt threatened personally because they're attacked. Of course, it's not new. And in particular, minority academics have been attacked for a long time, as, for example, Nassira Ghanif rightly points out. But today it is spreading. And so I think we have quite a few colleagues who just basically, for doing their job or for signing a petition, are being under virulent attacks on Twitter, etc., but don't quite know how much support they will get from their own institutions in this context. So I think intimidation is part of the game, because basically institutions are not always defined by their courage. They tend to adapt to the political climate. And this, I think, is a real consequence for real people, both students, high school teachers, and fellow academics. I think, of course, it applies differently depending on your position, depending on how precarious your position is, etc. But I want to point out that threats on academia are also threats on academics, as well as on teachers, students, etc.
Thank you, and thank you for this reminder. Thank you for this all these comments. I'm terribly sorry I could not bring to the fore all the questions, the super interesting questions that were in the Q&A. I would say one thing to Yanis Sidligakis, who's been writing several times, asking us to elaborate on the term, on the connections between Islamo-fascism and Islamo-leftism. I would just say that here you can see already in your question and in the way that people switch or slide from fascism to leftism, the polemical purchase of this kind of, of this kind of expressions, right? So obviously people who speak about Islamo-gauchisme, there is an echo of Islamo-fascism there, and they are playing on this echo. So that's all I would say to that question that was asked many times. I would also say that I would also mention another discussion that might be of interest to all the members of the audience next Tuesday, I think at 6:30, organized also by the Maison Française, a book panel. Is it 6 or 6:30? I forgot. You can actually look on the website of the Maison Française, and maybe someone is going to put this in the chat. It's a book panel on white freedom by Tyler Stovall and Professor Madeleine Doby, the chair of the French department at Columbia, Brent Edwards and Michelle Moody Adams, two wonderful colleagues at Columbia, will 6:30. Thank you, Shani. 6:30 on May 10, and I think that's Tuesday, right? And it's a wonderful book about the history of freedom and its association with whiteness as a value. So it's a intellectual history of a racial history of an idea. That the subtitle of the, it's with Robert Gooding Williams. I'm sorry, not Michel Moudiad, I'm sorry, and Madeleine Dobie. Monday, I'm a terrible announcer. It's absolutely terrible. Monday, May 10 at 6:30, White Freedom. And another wonderful event organized by the Maison Française. Now I'd like to thank everybody here. First, I would like to thank Shani Peer and Fanny Gay for their organization, their patience with us as we were rescheduling this event. And I would like also to thank profusely my old friends, I'm sorry to say so, but Eric Fassin and Maboula Soumahoro, who have been interlocutors for years, and really thankful for your willingness to tackle this difficult subject, which comes with real threats, with real difficulties. And also, I would like to thank the members of the audience, everybody was brave enough to stay with us until 3:22. I suppose that's it. Thank you very much to all, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.